There's a method to the madness. That is a phrase that does not apply to Embracer Group. They're basically the publisher, the huge game company that no one's ever heard of. You might have known them as THQ Nordic in the past, but they own a lot of studios, a lot of developers, 15,000 employees. And their big plan many years ago was basically buying up all the IPs and studios that no one was really familiar with. You might know some of them, like Gearbox with Borderlands, the Darksiders studio, who did the third game a little while back, and there's some others as well, Kingdom Come Deliverance, but not really AAA titles. Their whole goal seemed to be buying studios that people didn't know or Microsoft weren't ready to buy up. Studios that weren't really setting the world on fire, at least not yet. So they were probably able to buy them up fairly cheaply, and the aim was that these studios would put out mid-tier AA games, not really AAA, just games with a realistic budget that they could get a realistic return on, and then just keep pumping out heaps of them. Again, 100 plus different studios. Sadly, the whole thing's gone pear-shaped. You might have heard a little while ago that this company had a bunch of duds. Releases like the Saints Row reboot, which no one liked. That studio closed down, not a lot of sympathy. People thought, yeah, good riddance, sorry to hear you lost your jobs, but you guys are incompetent. Not sorry to see you go. That was the result there. It wasn't just dud games either. They actually had a huge deal fall through. They were relying on Saudi oil money. There was a Saudi gaming company, I believe, and they were going to invest $2 billion, a massive cash injection. Embracer relied on it. This Saudi company didn't really like the cut of their jib, at least at the last minute, because they pulled out. Embracer didn't get the money, and then their studios were left picking up the pieces, because Embracer have laid off 900 employees and shut down 15 games over its course of restructuring and stabilizing its business, they said. Crystal Dynamics, another studio that they own, who did Tomb Raider. They've done some other games as well, like the Marvel Avengers game. Probably the less said about that, the better. But they also laid off 10% of their staff. And that is where I worry. Again, a lot of their studios we just haven't heard of. They might be developing games in really niche genres outside role-playing games, genres we might normally play. But when it's Crystal Dynamics being affected, it concerns me because they're not far away from Eidos Montreal, who make the Deus Ex series, at least the more recent games like Human Revolution, Mankind Divided. I thought that studio was on a pretty good run. They were doing quite well. Mankind Divided had its flaws from a story perspective. The end of the game was basically missing it. It felt like it was cut off halfway and we just didn't get the end. But aside from that, the gameplay was excellent, really nice immersive sims, and myself, many others I believe, are quite nostalgic about those games because we just don't get that many immersive sims anymore. We saw what happened with Redfall. That reminded us that immersive sims are a great thing, and when you replace immersive sims with some sort of looter shooter mess of a game like that, it just makes you think about the Dishonored, the Deus Exes, other series in that vein. And with the Deus Ex studio, with Crystal Dynamics, they've had an interesting history because they used to be owned by Square Enix, and they were terrible with their Western IPs. Sure, if you're a fan of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, they can put out some good products, but they treated, for instance, IO Interactive, the Hitman developer, treated them terribly. We got episodic games for the longest time. They finally were able to get out on their own, and they've released some good stuff since. But certainly with Deus Ex, for instance, it was Square Enix who were responsible for Mankind Divided being cut short. They had ridiculous expectations when it came to sales numbers. I remember with Tomb Raider, they were expecting something like 25, 30 million copies sold, and that's Baldur's Gate 3 numbers, that's Cyberpunk numbers, and they were expecting that for Tomb Raider, which is a fairly mainstream series, but there's nothing super special about it. I mean, we've got the Uncharted games on Sony consoles now, so it can't really stand out. If that sells 10 million copies, surely you've got to think of that as a success, but they weren't having it. They ended up selling Crystal Dynamics and Eidos, the Deus Ex dev, to Embracer Group for what was seen as a pretty good deal, chump change. I believe it was around 300 million. At the time, it seemed like a bargain. It seemed like Embracer had something special on their hands because Eidos Montreal, they're one of the last genuinely good devs around who haven't really produced a dud. There's not many of those. I mean, for the longest time, CD Projekt Red, people were saying Witcher 1, Witcher 2 really good, Witcher 3 a classic, but then they dropped the ball with Cyberpunk. It was a blemish on their record. They've tried to redeem themselves, but people will not forget. That's never going to go away. You do have some devs like Larian. I hope they never drop the ball. They've been so consistent. They keep getting better and better. Certainly From Software, Elden Ring, their biggest game, they keep doing well. There's not many of those sorts of studios anymore, and it might be a little bit unpopular, but I honestly think that Eidos Montreal, their run of games, it's maybe not as good as Larian, not quite that top tier, but it's actually pretty good. If you look at their games, it's basically the Deus Ex titles, the recent ones I mentioned. There was the Thief game, which wasn't great, but I honestly think if that even came out this year, you'd probably think, yeah, that's alright. It doesn't have microtransactions. I hope Square Enix didn't add any later at least. And it was solid. It just wasn't as good as the old Thief games, not even close. I will say on the topic of Marvel games, Eidos did supposedly have a hand in Marvel's Avengers, and if that's not a blemish on someone's record, what is? But I really think that was Square Enix meddling with the studio. A little bit like Bethesda meddled with Arcane, and then we got Redfall, the dud of the year. That's sadly just what happens when out-of-touch publishers, business people get involved, because you've got these studios, they specialize in certain genres. The employees are passionate about these genres. When you try and get them just to push out something else, a product, nothing else, certainly not a game that's enjoyable for the devs or the players, that's how you get these piles of crap. So even though Marvel's Avengers, we can count that as a blemish for Eidos, I still think that was really a Square Enix cock-up. I don't really think it was Eidos. So if you put an asterisk next to that game, Eidos have released incredible titles, especially the Deus Ex games, and I want more of those. I want to see more immersive sims come out, because it feels like the lost, forgotten genre. And the problem I feel there is they've just never been marketed correctly. There's even arguments to this day about what an immersive sim is. For me at least, I don't want to overcomplicate it. I just see it as a game where you can approach situations in different ways, but they're very gameplay focused. For something really recent, I would even consider some aspects of Cyberpunk to be quite immersive sim-like. Many of the gigs, especially some of the main missions when you get into the gameplay side, they feel like immersive sims. You go to some sort of compound, some sort of outpost, and it's up to you to decide how you approach the situation. Depending on the build of your character, you might stealth your way in there, you might go for guns blazing, you'll kill everyone. You might use technology, you might hack open a door, you might use gadgets to scale your way up a tall building. Lots of ways to approach many different situations, and that for me is really all it is. It's about choice. The waters might get a bit muddied with, obviously, role-playing games, because they're meant to be the same, right? You can approach situations differently. I just feel the difference is, while immersive sims will have story, the gameplay often comes first compared to a lot of RPGs, where it is more about the story, and Cyberpunk you'd certainly call an RPG first, more than immersive sim, compared to like a Deus Ex, a Dishonored, but hopefully you get my distinction. If we get too technical with it, you get in that old situation. I always see people throw it around where it's like, if I play Zelda, I'm playing as Link. I'm role-playing as Link, so that's an RPG, right? Sure, you can say that, but if you muddy the waters that much, then what's even a genre of games? I think we can keep it simple, and I think most people have an understanding of what immersive sims are if they're fans. The issue is people who are not fans already. How do they get into the genre? Because we saw with, say, a Prey, Dishonored, even Deathloop, that Bethesda were determined to market them as action games. And it wasn't until I actually picked up Deathloop that I realized it was trying to be an immersive sim. It may not be the best one in the world, it's not as good as any of the Dishonored games really, but it was somewhat an immersive sim that was just marketed incorrectly. The sales numbers for these games always seem to be middling, and it's almost not fair, because you just feel if enough people got into them, understood what they were playing and what was possible, that many people would love them. We've seen with Baldur's Gate 3 that that's an example of what could be considered niche game design in 2023. Turn-based combat, a lot of talking, a lot of dialogues, plenty of reading, and yet it sold gangbusters. It would be the same for a quality immersive sim. Coming back to Deus Ex, the Human Revolution game actually sold quite well. I wonder why that was, if it was good marketing at the time, or if it was just the name and plenty of people were nostalgic for the original that released, I think, in 2000. Mankind Divided didn't sell as well, but I think, again, that was Square Enix's fault. The gameplay was fantastic, but the word of mouth went around that the story was lacking, that it just fell short because they cut it in half, essentially. There was a rumor at that time that Square Enix wanted to split it into maybe 2 or 3 games, and rather than give people a complete experience, they essentially left us with a cliffhanger. It wasn't even a cliffhanger, was it? I think it was just, it ended abruptly, and that was about it. It just didn't feel like a proper ending, but that turned some people off. It's difficult for a sequel to sell better than its predecessor if there's not really positive word of mouth going around, because otherwise you get the fans of the first one who might buy it, but if literally anyone who played the first didn't like it, they're not going to pick it up again. So how do you get new people? People have to be very positive about the game, and they weren't because of Square Enix meddling. So now that Deus Ex is with Embracer, I was really hoping that we were going to get a new title. There was a rumor a while back, I think it was Jason Schreier. He's a bit weaselly on Twitter and things if you look around, but he is a reliable leaker. He does his job well in that department. And he did mention that there was a Deus Ex game in early development. This was a couple of years ago, so maybe they've been making some progress with it. I know Eidos, the Deus Ex developer, they were working on a new IP as well, which sounded a bit like Zelda, a bit like Tomb Raider. So what was going to happen is the new IP would come out, then we get a Deus Ex. But with all this news about Embracer having so much trouble, I wonder about that, because if they've cancelled 15 games, they're probably going to start cancelling the ones that are expensive to make and aren't guaranteed hits. And as sad as it is to say, I don't know if a Deus Ex in 2026, 2027, whenever it comes out, if it's a guaranteed hit. I could absolutely inhale copium and say, oh, I love Deus Ex, I know everyone's going to join me and buy it. But that's why I was talking about the immersive sims not being marketed well, not selling well earlier, because it's not really a proven genre when it comes to those sales numbers and bringing in the money. I hope they stick with it. I hope that they're cancelling anything that's just really unproven. So new IPs, maybe genres, maybe studios that are operating in really niche spaces. Because even if we do say that Deus Ex probably isn't going to hit Cyberpunk numbers, it's not going to hit Baldur's Gate numbers, but they might feel, hey, there's not many immersive sims out there anymore. Arcane had a big piece of that market, but now people are losing faith in them. There is news that we might be getting a Dishonored 3. There was a leak a while back, but some people might have question marks on whether they can deliver anymore, because the studio founder at Arcane, he left a while back and basically said, I want to make games, I don't just want to make products. That's what happens in the AAA space. And at least with Embracer, there aren't heaps of signs, I think, of sort of publisher meddling, where they're forcing every game to be a live service. If anything, they're not really encouraging that, or they haven't been. They have been more focused on studios releasing smaller titles, not massive mountain climbing budgets, just realistic ones where they can get a game out that doesn't have to sell zillions of copies. So maybe they give Deus Ex the benefit of the doubt with that as well. They give it a chance. I'd like them to not get overly ambitious. I'm simply looking for a handful of nice hub worlds with interesting quests, exploration, make it a bit like Bloodlines if we want to talk about an even older title, that kind of style. I really enjoyed it, and I don't think we get enough of that anymore. There was actually the RoboCop Rogue City game. Didn't really cover it on this channel, but it is a very nice game. I haven't finished it, but it does have those hub worlds as well, and that has some nice immersive sim elements, but you could really expand on that with a Deus Ex. Get back to those conspiracy storylines, whether it's Adam Jensen or they go with a new character and reboot it. I don't really care at this stage. It's been so long since we got an Adam Jensen game that if it doesn't get tied off, I'm not going to lose sleep. I'm okay if we get something that's competent, as much as it would be nice to finish that story. So the short of it is, when it comes to Deus Ex, we don't know for sure if it has been cancelled or not. Apparently out of these 15 games, they've actually got hundreds in development, so the numbers would suggest it's unlikely Deus Ex is one of them if we look at purely the stats there, the percentages. But it could always happen at any point, because it's always just bad news these days with Embracer. They're closing a studio down, they're laying people off. It's hard to say what's going to happen, but I hope at least that they sell Deus Ex off. They don't just close the studio and sit on the IP. If it gets to that, I'd much rather someone pick them up. Even though I don't like these conglomerates like Microsoft buying up everything, it's better that at least someone is making a Deus Ex than it just sit there and nothing happens. That has happened to so many of my favorite IPs. I think about, this is going to be so niche, but like a Monkey Island that sat there doing nothing for years and years until we got a new game there many years later. I want to mention something lastly. This was a few days ago, but there was yet more bad Embracer news, where the CEO just flat out refused to talk about the Knights of the Old Republic remake. We heard it was in development a while back. I think Sony were involved as well. There was a cinematic trailer which revealed absolutely nothing. As usual, that seems to be the way these days. But people got excited. Oh, Knights of the Old Republic, this could be great. We're going to get our favorite game back. The studio behind it, I think they said it was going to be action combat. It was going to be for modern audiences. So whether it was actually going to be worth playing, I don't know. And that may not even be a factor anymore, because the CEO of Embracer was asked about KOTOR, and all he said was, I noticed that anything I say becomes a headline. So this is my only comment. This isn't the RPG remake you're looking for. You can go about your business, move along. Now, I don't know if he's a secret fan of KOTOR, and he looked at it and went, they've taken everything good about the original out, they've maybe put a bunch of modern audience stuff in there, they've taken out the turn-based combat, just forget about it or move on. Or the more likely outcome is it has just been cancelled and he's encouraging people just to not talk about it anymore. Let's forget that we ever showed that cinematic trailer, let's forget we tried to hype it up, just forget about it, buy our new game instead. I wonder if it's got something to do with so many, I suppose, organizations being involved. I mentioned Sony, Aspire the developer, and then of course Embracer Group. If something to do with the logistics just means they can't officially cancel it, it could be corporate shenanigans, contract negotiations, who knows, but I think it's pretty safe to say that it's dead. If it ever comes out, I think it's going to be a Vampire Bloodlines 2 situation, where they're just trying to get it out there so they haven't wasted all their development costs, and probably something fans can just forget about. Play something else. Maybe Larian will make a sci-fi game. I saw rumors of that in the past, so you never know, we could get lucky there. But there's no good news for Embracer. So far, no good news, but also no bad news for Deus Ex, so I'll keep my fingers crossed. I hope we get more from the Deus Ex series, perhaps Adam Jensen. That'd be nice. We need more immersive sims. They are one of my favorite genres. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.